AI is definitely also very good at launching attacks on
Hmm.
neighbors' infrastructure, and I'll
Right,
share that story with you later in the session, where
right,
how one of
right.
the frontier AI model provider launched, of course, not intentionally, unintentionally, against another AI provider, which is pretty funny and a lot of lessons to be learned there.
Right, right. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? I know our live audience is building. Just want to say we're going to be talking about something really exciting today. We're going to talk about, so Mythos is everywhere in the news. We're going to dive into something that I think is really topical. It's, what is life post Mythos? How is it impacting all of us? And I guess I first want to apologize by saying Crit is not able to join us today. Crit is our SE, one of our SEs, and he's actually, because of Mythos, battling more and more cyber incidents. So I think it's something that's going to be really helpful to us, but it's also driving a lot of concern among our customer base. And there are also, more and more CVEs being found. So how do you deal with those? So, I think timing is perfect. Unfortunately, we don't have Crit, but Prateek, I know you're going to fill his large shoes. But we're going to talk about really how life has changed after AI. You don't need me to tell you, but AI is obviously in everything. I unfortunately had to go to the hospital a couple of months ago, and I actually saw they were using AI to help figure out the diagnosis, which was a little unnerving to me. AI is everywhere, right? And I guess I have a question for you. Do you know when AI was first used in cybersecurity, Prateek?
That's a very interesting one. The new generation of people would say AI was invented in 2021 when ChatGPT came into being, but it was much before that. It was 2015 when I was with Gartner, I remember, when Silence introduced machine learning algorithm and capabilities
Yeah.
directly in the agent itself, which was quite a disruption back in those days, where the endpoint protection platform and antivirus would rely on signatures. So I think that was the biggest scale of implementation of AI and machine learning back in those days, and then it has certainly progressed so much from then, from machine learning to deep neural network to deep learning to Gen AI and now agentic AI. So a lot is happening.
Right. And for the audience who don't know, Prateek has been with a lot of major cybersecurity companies, but was also a esteemed and established Gartner analyst. So it's good to get your perspective on Cylance. I do wonder way back then in 2015, if somebody said, don't worry, AI is on your endpoints, did that give them more security, a sense of, security, or more concern? I'm betting it's the latter.
It's the
And what's interesting is here we are more than a decade later, and people still have that concern, and they have a lot more concern. So, AI is a fascinating topic, and it's really as good as kind of the use you put into it. And there's really this dual role, right, with Mythos. It's being used for good, but it's also being used by attackers to create these, almost like disastrous, zero-day immediate attacks that nobody's prepared for. And that's really what I think we want to uncover today is the CVE as we know it still valuable? How should we be thinking about it? So maybe, let's take you with your background and your broad perspective on the industry, Prateek. Tell us, what do you think is happening in the AI world? How is it impacting these growing number of vulnerabilities? It's growing exponentially every year and at a faster and faster pace. And I've never talked to a CISO or a security team who say, we have our hand around all the CVEs. We've patched everything. We're down to patch 0. You never get there, right? It's just not even possible. So how's Mythos impacting all of that, Prateek?
Yeah. So, Dan, my favorite line: if patches could solve all the cybersecurity problems, you and I would not have a job today. It's unfortunate
Yeah.
that patches are the solution, and it's unfortunate that patches are the problem at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, AI has certainly increased the number of CVEs that we have to deal with, as if we did not have enough number of vulnerabilities to deal with in the past. Even before Mythos preview or the frontier AI models, the number of vulnerabilities were increasing at a fast pace. I believe
Mhm.
if you look at the Hive Pro Global Vulnerability Intelligence Report, it is growing by 20-25% every year. And last year alone, it was 50,000 vulnerabilities. And now imagine frontier AI model will increase the number of vulnerability discovery by a large extent, because now it's an automated way of identifying vulnerabilities. And you look at Project Glasswing results, if you look at the lab results of Mythos preview, it was able to identify vulnerabilities as old as 15 years old in open source systems. So we have to certainly brace ourselves for the onslaught of vulnerabilities and CVEs that we have to deal with. But there is always a silver lining, Dan. I mean, yes, it is sounding very scary that I was
Yep.
already dealing with 50,000 vulnerabilities in a year, and now you're saying it will grow exponentially. But the silver lining is that all these vulnerabilities do not represent risk. We have to go and identify the risk associated with these vulnerabilities. And, we have to make sure that it's contextual for us.
So I hear you talking about CSR. I've heard you mention it, and I know our customers get excited and they want to know a lot about it. And when I heard you describe it, it made a lot of sense to me. And so, like, what maybe you could talk a little bit about a CRE. What is it, and are CVEs still relevant? I guess is one question I have. Should I be tracking them, as somebody on in a SOC or as a CISO? So our CVE is still relevant, but what is a CRE, and why should people be thinking a little differently and changing the way they perceive risk in their organization?
Yep. Dan, please allow me to share my screen because I have a few
Yeah,
slides
please.
that I've prepared, which will make things a lot more easier for folks around here. So I do remember you mentioned something CSR. I know I use that very commonly in our one-to-one conversation, but for broader audience, let me spell it out, because the most common understanding of CSR is corporate social responsibility. Yes, even this is our responsibility, but not so social, but a lot more security or cyber related. So by CSR, I mean context, speed, and risk-free risk reduction. So
Mhm.
right now, in the world of AI, where vulnerabilities are coming out every single minute and multiple numbers in a minute, we have to we have to take an approach or a framework of CSR, that is context, speed, and risk-free risk reduction. What is context? In security, context has always been the major, or context has always been at the core of any security operations. A security alert for one organization may not mean the same for another organization. It may just be a false positive or a business as usual. So context is very important to be used in the age of AI today. Speed. AI is doing things at an exponential speed. I mean, it's not, the earlier the exploits would be measured, or the time to exploit would be measured in days. Now it is in hours, 1 hour, 2 hour on an average. So it's no longer the case that, okay, you have a vulnerability and it would take 7 days at least before it starts getting exploited on an average. Now it is in hours. So you have a very small time window. And then risk reduction or risk-free risk reduction. you know uh, Dan, I'm sure as you are also talking to multiple security leaders and go on LinkedIn very often, there is a lot of noise on LinkedIn where a lot of solution providers are recommending faster patching, that now deploy patches faster than ever. I think the that's not going to work in our favor, for the reason that patches break system, which is an unfortunate reality. Yes, patches will definitely reduce the risk, but patches, if not tested properly, will break the systems, and that can be a very costly mistake, and that can create a lot more disruption than what AI attacker or AI based attacker could bring on the table. So this is what I mean by CSR. Dan, any thoughts, comments, Dan, from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think, yeah, I think being able to patch faster is a completely wrong way of looking at it, and it's fighting the old battle, right? I think you're fighting the wrong battle, and I think really with AI, we really need to change the way we think. And if you're still kind of stack ranking CVEs, patching them, trying to patch faster, trying to do more, that's a futile, like, hamster wheel approach. So I don't think that's the right way to look at it at all. And that's why we're having this discussion, right? Is like, how should people be thinking differently? And I think people are already making paradigm shifts with AI, but definitely we need to think about how we address risk and how we respond to it. There's more CVEs are being found, which is great, but we also need to apply those same principles to how we respond.
Absolutely. And Dan, I just came up with a phrase: patching faster is a disaster. It rhymes, right?
I like it. By the way, there's a QR code. I get a message every time somebody scans the QR code, and I keep seeing it flashing. So people in the audience are scanning the QR code. What do they get when they scan that, just to be clear?
I believe there is a report. There is a report on shiny hunters about the IOCs and indicators of attack, how they are launching attacks. It's a very detailed report written by our threat intelligence team, and that would help them in protecting themselves against shiny hunters. And if you have not heard of shiny hunters, then I would say, unfortunately, you're in the wrong field.
Yeah, that's actually our top downloaded report by threat teams. So I encourage you, if you haven't checked it out, don't read it during this session, but definitely download it and read it after. So getting back to our discussion, Prateek, so we covered context, right? We talked about the C and the CSR framework. What about speed and risk-free? Like, is there such thing as that? And like, what does that mean?
Absolutely. Dan, I had one question that I did not answer of yours. I know that I should have done that. You also mentioned something about CRE, right?
Yeah.
So you commonly hear me and Craig very commonly talking about, don't focus on CVEs, focus on CRE, right? Yeah. And you may be thinking, oh, what is that CRE? So Dan, let me admit it already, I made it up. That's my
you're a Gartner analyst, former Gartner analyst. So these terms came from somewhere, right?
Yeah. So, I love creating these terms, which are, of course, useful, not something just out of the whack. So CVEs are something, vulnerabilities which are out there in the global, out there in the world. But not all these CVEs may be present in your organization. Even if those CVEs are present in your organization, not all those CVEs represent exposure and risk. So how do you move from CVE to CRE? And that is where the exposure comes into the picture. Sorry, that is where the context comes into the picture. You remember the C of CSR, context. So this is where, when you apply context of your organization on the CVE, you get CRE. And what is CRE? It is contextual risk and exposure that you should go about fixing, or you should go about reducing right away. So you look at the fact whether there are security controls in place which can effectively stop the attacks, which the vulnerabilities, stop the attacks that vulnerabilities can cause, whether the system in which this vulnerability is present, it's in a corner of the network where no one is accessing it. So does it really represent an exposure? Does it really represent a risk to the organization? The access control to a server is very limited. So does it really represent exposure and risk to your organization? So all these taken into account, the organization context will help you cut the noise of CVE and help you derive CRE. So my recommendation to all the security leaders is to stop chasing CVEs and start focusing on CREs, which are contextual risk and exposure, which are specific to your organization. Rather than worrying about the problems in the world, let's worry about the problems that we have in our organization and fix those first.
So how hard is it for the typical security team to get that context? And maybe you could weave like, I'm not looking for a commercial here, but how does Hive Pro do that? How do you do it without Hive Pro, and how do you do it with? I guess is what I'm asking.
Amazing. So without Hive Pro, you will have to have multiple technologies integrated with each other, or rather, even say, use the result of one into another tool and then pass the context of one tool into another, and it becomes very challenging. A lot of manual exercise that you will have to do, a lot of integration, and a lot of data correlation you will have to do manually. With Hypro platform, you get the entire context in one single platform, in one single workflow. So right from identifying the vulnerabilities to see which all vulnerabilities are currently getting exploited in the wild, then validating those vulnerabilities. Validation of vulnerabilities sits at the core of any exposure management today. And you can see multiple such industry events happening across the world, across the industry, where breach and attack simulation capability or adversarial exposure validation capability helps you cut the noise of vulnerabilities by validating the vulnerabilities first, using the context that you see in the screen right now. And then you remember the S and R part of CSR, Dan? Speed
Yep, I
and risk
do.
free. Hypro helps you instantly reduce the risk by automatically deploying IOCs and IOAs on the EDR and SIM platform. So with the click of a button, you can deploy the IOCs and IOAs on the EDR platform to reduce the risk substantially while you are going about the patch testing and fixing the vulnerability. So maybe let me show you this, which you may
Yeah,
find very
please.
interesting. So Hypro recommends mitigation first and patch fast approach to fixing this onslaught of vulnerabilities in the AI era. And why are we recommending mitigation first? Because let's say you see this on day zero, you see a high risk vulnerability in your environment. So you can implement automated mitigation control with the click of a button, as I mentioned, by pushing the IOCs, by pushing the indicators of attack, by recommending the Sigma rules, and you lower down the risk on day zero itself while you are figuring out the patch workflow. So let's say you did not take automated mitigation control approach.
Hmm.
So a typical patch workflow would be that you are going about patch testing, then you are doing patch deployment, or doing patch deployment on sample number of systems, then you are deploying the patches in multiple systems, then you're restarting the system before the patch becomes effective, and it takes almost 30 days before you are able to deploy the patches successfully. Just imagine if you do not deploy automated mitigation controls, your exposure window will be as long as 30 days. And do you remember what I had mentioned in
That's
the beginning, Dan? Now the exploit is happening within hours,
right.
not months.
Think
So
of the
it's
damage. Think of the damage that could happen in 30 days.
exactly, attackers can literally own your systems, and it's almost like a a field day for them, because it will be so easy for them to launch attacks.
Got
So
it.
we recommend mitigation first and patch fast approach in the age of AI.
It's you almost never hear in the security world zero risk or almost zero risk. So that approach is radically different. And I mean, I feel like in the age of Mythos, the world has shifted so quickly. Like, I think our response needs to be equally as aggressive, right? And so I really like what you're talking about, and I think it's very timely given like this avalanche that we're facing. So I know we're out of time, and I know you wanted to show a demo as well. I don't think we have time for that, but I guess what are your, just to conclude and wrap up with the audience, what are your top recommendations?
So my top recommendations, I am always a firm believer of changing the mindset than just changing the tool, right? So my recommendation to all the security leaders today is that change the way you are conducting exposure management. So stop focusing on CVEs and start focusing on CREs. Derive CREs from CVEs. Stop focusing on just risk remediation, right? Risk remediation is mostly about deploying the patches to make sure that the vulnerability is patched. But patching takes a long time. You do not want to
Yeah.
do patching in haste because it can break systems. So change the approach of deploying, change the approach of seeing and perceiving patch as the only solution to reducing the risk instantly in no given time. And that is where mitigation controls come into the picture. IOCs, IOAs, detection rules, sigma rules, making changes in the configuration of the system so that the vulnerability exploitation becomes the probability of vulnerability exploitation becomes almost nil or close to nil. Then vulnerability management is often perceived and recommended as a solution which is on the left hand side. So Dan, this is what I very commonly say. Left and right would not talk to each other, right? So saying that shift the technology to the left hand side, that's not the right approach. We need to bring exposure management platform in the core and center of your security operations, where your exposure management platform will guide security operations center in terms of, okay, I see this system has this particular exposure, and based on this exposure, this should be the detection rule your SIM should have, so that while I am fixing this exposure, this vulnerability, if exploited, will be detected by SIM. And the SIM should be able to then identify what are the data points that I need to fetch from these systems to make sure that this detection rule is effective. So exposure management should sit at the center and be that guiding light for security operations center at the same time, or security operations at the same time.
Yeah, I think if we're not moving at the pace of the attacker, we're like there's just no way to be successful. I think you have to be not only moving at their pace but faster, right? So it's a complete change in mindset. Well, great. I hope Crit did chime in here with a text message on the screen. I don't know if you saw that, so it's good to have him at least in the background. I hope he can join us next time. I know we wanted to do a live demo, but he got called away for a Mythos-driven security opportunity or challenge, if you will. So it's good to do these always, and thanks to you in the audience for joining. Let us know if you have any questions. And feel free to download the risk report on Shiny Hunters. It's this is a report we just released about a week and a half ago. It's full of information, and it's from the Hive Force Labs team that produces all this content. So feel free to grab that. And thanks for joining us, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.